The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of the downtown courthouse as two identical twin brothers walked through the heavy wooden doors. David and Daniel Thompson looked like any other working-class men entering the building that Tuesday morning. They wore simple jeans, plain t-shirts, and old sneakers that had seen better days. Their hair was slightly messy, and they spoke with thick street accents that echoed through the marble hallways. "Man, this place is huge," David said, looking around at the grand ceiling and marble columns. "I ain't never been in no courthouse this fancy before." Daniel nodded, adjusting his baseball cap. "Yeah, bro. Look at all these people in suits walking around like they own the place. Makes you feel real small, you know?" What nobody in that courthouse knew, not even the security guards who barely glanced at them, was that these two brothers held law degrees from one of the most respected universities in the country. They had graduated at the top of their class, passed the bar exam with flying colors, and were currently working on one of the most important cases of their careers. The brothers were undercover investigators for the state government. Their job was to find judges who treated people unfairly because of their race or social status. They had been working this case for 3 months, and today was going to be a big test. They made their way to the information desk, where a middle-aged woman with glasses looked up from her computer. Her eyes quickly scanned them from head to toe, and her expression changed from neutral to slightly annoyed. "Can I help you?" she asked in a tone that suggested she really didn't want to. "Yes, ma'am," David replied, making his voice sound uncertain. "We got this court thing today with Judge Whitman. Room 304, I think. We ain't sure where that is." The woman sighed and pointed toward the elevator. "3rd floor. Follow the signs. Next." The brothers exchanged a quick look as they walked away. They had already seen how differently people treated them when they dressed and spoke this way. It was all part of their investigation, but it still stung every time. As they rode the elevator to the 3rd floor, Daniel whispered, "You remember everything we practiced?" David nodded. "Act confused about legal stuff. Ask simple questions. Let him show his true colors. And keep the recorder going the whole time," Daniel added, patting his shirt pocket where a tiny recording device was hidden. The elevator doors opened, and they walked down a long hallway lined with courtroom doors. Room 304 was at the end, and they could already hear voices coming from inside. They took a deep breath and pushed open the heavy door. The courtroom was exactly what you'd expect from movies and TV shows. High ceilings, wooden benches arranged in rows, and a big desk at the front where the judge would sit. About 20 people were scattered throughout the room, some in expensive suits, others in regular clothes like the brothers. They found seats in the back row and waited. David pulled out a small notebook and pen, pretending to struggle with writing down basic information. In reality, he was documenting everything he saw, but he made it look like he barely knew how to write. At exactly 9 o'clock, a side door opened and Judge Harold Whitman entered the room. He was a tall, thin man in his 60s with gray hair and wire-rimmed glasses. His black robe flowed behind him as he walked to his chair behind the big wooden desk. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Whitman," called out the court clerk. Everyone in the room stood up. Judge Whitman sat down and immediately started looking through a stack of papers on his desk. His eyes moved across the room, stopping briefly on the brothers in the back. Even from a distance, they could see his expression change slightly, like he was already making judgments about who they were. "Thompson versus State of California, case number 47293, the clerk announced. David and Daniel stood up and walked toward the front of the courtroom. As they got closer, Judge Whitman looked up from his papers and stared at them with obvious disapproval. "Are you the defendants in this case?" Judge Whitman asked, his voice carrying a tone that suggested he already didn't like what he saw. "Yes, sir, Your Honor," David replied, deliberately making his grammar sound uncertain. "That's us, David and Daniel Thompson." Judge Whitman leaned back in his chair and looked them up and down slowly. "And where's your attorney?" The brothers looked at each other, pretending to be confused. "We was told we could talk to someone here," Daniel said, "like a public defender or something." Judge Whitman's eyebrows raised, and he let out a small laugh that wasn't friendly at all. "Of course you were. Let me guess. You gentlemen probably couldn't afford to hire a real lawyer, could you?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Several people in the courtroom turned to look at the brothers, and the judge's comment made everyone uncomfortable. David and Daniel had expected this, but hearing it still made their hearts race. "Well, sir," David said, keeping his voice humble, "we ain't got a lot of money, no, sir. We're just trying to figure out what's going on with this case." Judge Whitman rolled his eyes so dramatically that people in the front row could see it. "This is exactly what's wrong with the system," he said, speaking to his clerk but loud enough for everyone to hear. "People come into my courtroom with no understanding of the law, no respect for the process, and expect everything to be handed to them." The court reporter's fingers paused over her keyboard for a moment. This wasn't normal judicial behavior, and she knew it. "Your Honor," Daniel said, trying to sound nervous, "we just want to understand what we're supposed to do. This is all new to us." "I'm sure it is," Judge Whitman replied sarcastically. "Let me make something very clear to you both. This is a court of law, not some street corner where you can talk however you want. If you're going to be in my courtroom, you need to learn how to speak properly and show some respect." The brothers felt their anger rising, but they had trained for this moment. They knew that staying calm and letting the judge continue talking would give them exactly what they needed for their investigation. "We sorry, Your Honor," David said, making his voice even more humble. "We just don't know much about all this legal stuff. Could you maybe explain what's happening?" Judge Whitman looked at his watch and sighed loudly. "This is going to take forever," he muttered. Then, looking back at the brothers, he said, "The state has charged you with a traffic violation. You allegedly ran a red light 6 months ago. It's a simple case that should have been resolved already, but apparently some people don't understand the importance of taking care of their responsibilities." What Judge Whitman didn't know was that the brothers had deliberately let this simple case drag on for months. It was the perfect excuse to keep appearing in his courtroom and documenting his behavior. The traffic violation was real but minor, and they could have paid the fine and been done with it long ago. "So what we supposed to do now?" Daniel asked. "You're supposed to enter a plea," Judge Whitman said impatiently. "Guilty or not guilty, it's not rocket science." The way he said rocket science made it clear he didn't think they were smart enough for much of anything. The brothers exchanged another look, and David could see that Daniel was fighting to keep his composure. "Could we maybe talk to that public defender person first?" David asked. "We really don't understand what pleading guilty or not guilty means for us." Judge Whitman's face showed pure frustration. He looked at the clock on the wall and then back at the brothers with clear annoyance. "Fine. But you're wasting everyone's time here. This court has important business to conduct, and we can't spend all day explaining basic concepts to people who should have figured this out months ago." As the brothers walked back to their seats to wait for the public defender, they could hear Judge Whitman talking to his clerk in a voice that wasn't quite quiet enough. "This is exactly the problem," he was saying. "People like that come in here, expecting everything to be explained to them like they're children. No personal responsibility whatsoever." The court reporter continued typing, capturing every word. The brothers sat down, knowing that their investigation was off to exactly the start they had hoped for, even though it hurt to be on the receiving end of such treatment. They had no idea that in just a few weeks Judge Whitman would discover exactly who they really were, and that everything he had just said was being recorded for a much larger purpose than he could ever imagine. 3 weeks had passed since that first uncomfortable morning in Judge Whitman's courtroom. David and Daniel Thompson had returned 4 more times, each visit revealing more of the judge's true character. Today was different, though. Today the judge seemed particularly irritated, and the brothers could sense it the moment they walked through the courthouse doors. "You think he's having a bad day?" Daniel whispered as they rode the elevator to the 3rd floor. "Every day is a bad day for him when people like us show up," David replied, checking to make sure his hidden recording device was working properly. The courtroom was busier than usual. Several lawyers in expensive suits sat in the front rows, and a few news reporters had notebooks ready. The brothers took their usual seats in the back, watching as Judge Whitman entered and surveyed the room with his typical stern expression. "Thompson, case," the clerk called out after handling 2 other matters. As the brothers approached the front, Judge Whitman's face immediately showed annoyance. It was like watching someone who had just did something unpleasant. Oh, wonderful, Judge Whitman said, not bothering to hide his sarcasm. The Thompson brothers are back. Let me guess, you still haven't figured out how to handle a simple traffic ticket? David put on his most confused expression. Well, sir, we've been trying to understand everything, but this legal stuff is real complicated for folks like us. Folks like you? Judge Whitman leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. And what exactly does that mean? The question was a trap, and the brothers knew it. If they said anything about race or class, he could claim they were playing the victim. If they said nothing, he would continue his inappropriate behavior. Just regular working people, Your Honor, Daniel said carefully. We ain't been to college, or nothing like that. Judge Whitman's laugh was cold and mean. That's abundantly clear. You know what your problem is? You come from a culture that doesn't value education or personal responsibility. You expect everyone else to solve your problems for you. Several people in the courtroom shifted uncomfortably in their seats. One of the lawyers in the front row raised his eyebrows and started taking notes. The court reporter's fingers hesitated for just a moment before continuing to type. We trying our best, sir, David said, keeping his voice humble while his blood boiled. Could you maybe explain what we're supposed to do? We really want to do the right thing. The right thing? Judge Whitman's voice got louder. The right thing would have been to pay this ticket 6 months ago instead of wasting everyone's time. But people from your background don't think about consequences, do you? The brothers exchanged a quick glance. Every word was being recorded, and Judge Whitman was digging himself deeper with each sentence. What do you mean by our background? Sir? Daniel asked innocently. Judge Whitman caught himself for just a second, realizing he might have gone too far, but his arrogance quickly took over again. I mean, people who don't take education seriously, who don't speak properly, who dress like they just rolled out of bed, he said, gesturing at their simple clothes. Look at yourselves. You come into my courtroom looking like you're going to a basketball game, not a legal proceeding. The comment about basketball hit exactly the way the judge intended it to. It was a stereotype wrapped in what he probably thought was acceptable criticism. We're sorry about our clothes, Your Honor, David said. We don't got much money for fancy suits. That's we don't have much money, Judge Whitman corrected sharply. If you're going to be in my courtroom, at least try to speak like you have some education, although I suppose that might be asking too much. One of the lawyers in the front row actually turned around to stare at the judge. This kind of behavior was way beyond anything they had ever seen in a courtroom. The public defender, a young woman named Lisa Chen, finally approached the brothers. She looked nervous and kept glancing at Judge Whitman with obvious concern. Your Honor, she said politely, I'd like to request a brief recess to speak with my clients about their options. Judge Whitman looked at his watch dramatically. 5 minutes, and make it quick. Some of us have real cases to handle today. As they stepped into the hallway, Lisa immediately pulled the brothers aside. What is going on in there? She whispered urgently. I've never seen a judge behave like that. His comments are completely inappropriate. David and Daniel looked at each other. They couldn't break their cover, even to someone who was trying to help them. We don't know, ma'am, David said. Is that not normal? No, it's not normal at all, Lisa replied. He's making comments that could be considered discriminatory. I should file a complaint. We don't want no trouble, Daniel said quickly. We just want to get this over with. Lisa looked frustrated but nodded. Okay, but I want you to know that you don't have to accept being treated like that. No one does. When they returned to the courtroom, Judge Whitman was already looking impatient. Well, he demanded, have you finally figured out what you want to do? My clients would like to enter a plea of not guilty, Your Honor, Lisa said professionally. Judge Whitman's face showed genuine surprise. Not guilty? For running a red light? There's video evidence. There were witnesses. What possible defense could you have? That's what we'd like to explore in a proper hearing, Your Honor, Lisa replied. The judge stared at the brothers like they had just insulted his mother. This is exactly what I'm talking about, he said to no one in particular. No accountability, no common sense. They think they can just deny reality and somehow get away with it. He paused and looked directly at David and Daniel. Let me make something very clear to you both. I've been a judge for 15 years, and I can spot troublemakers from a mile away. You fit the profile perfectly. Young men from your community, who think the rules don't apply to them. The word community hung in the air like a loaded weapon. Everyone in the courtroom knew exactly what he meant, even if he hadn't said it directly. We just want a fair chance to explain what happened that day, Daniel said. A fair chance? Judge Whitman's voice was getting louder again. You've had 6 months to take responsibility for your actions. Instead, you've dragged this simple case through my court multiple times, wasting taxpayer money and everyone's time. That's not how people should behave in a civilized society. The brothers could see several people in the courtroom looking shocked. One older man was shaking his head in disbelief. A reporter was writing furiously in her notebook. Your Honor, Lisa tried to interrupt. Perhaps we could... I'm not finished, Judge Whitman cut her off. These two need to understand that actions have consequences. In my courtroom, everyone is held to the same standard, regardless of where they come from or what excuses they think they can make. But his actions were proving the exact opposite of his words. The brothers had sat in this same courtroom and watched him treat other defendants completely differently. Just last week, they had seen him give a friendly warning to a well-dressed white businessman who had been caught speeding twice in 1 month. We understand, sir, David said. We just hope you'll give us the same fair treatment you give everyone else. Something in David's tone must have struck a nerve because Judge Whitman's face got red. Don't you dare lecture me about fairness, young man, he snapped. I've been fair to more people than you could ever imagine. But fairness doesn't mean letting people get away with bad behavior just because they come from difficult circumstances. What difficult circumstances? Daniel asked, genuinely curious to see how far the judge would go. Judge Whitman paused, realizing he was about to say something that could get him in serious trouble. But his arrogance wouldn't let him stop. You know exactly what I mean, he said. The breakdown of family values, the lack of respect for authority, the entitlement mentality that's become so common in certain parts of our society. The courtroom had gone completely silent. Even the court reporter looked uncomfortable as she continued typing every word. I'm going to set a trial date for this case, Judge Whitman announced. Maybe by then you'll have learned to take this seriously. Trial is set for 4 weeks from today. And gentlemen, I suggest you use that time to think about whether you really want to put everyone through this charade. As the brothers left the courtroom that day, they knew they had captured something extraordinary. Judge Whitman had revealed his true character in front of witnesses, and every word was now part of their growing case file. 4 more weeks, David whispered, as they walked down the courthouse steps. 4 more weeks to let him hang himself, Daniel replied. They had no idea that Judge Whitman's worst behavior was still to come. The coffee shop across from the courthouse had become David and Daniel's unofficial office. For the past month, they had spent almost every morning there watching people come and go while reviewing their notes and recordings. Today felt different, though. They had gathered enough evidence against Judge Whitman to ruin his career. But what they discovered about his other cases made them realize this was bigger than just their investigation. Look at this, David said, sliding a newspaper across the small table to his brother. The headline read, Local Judge Under Fire for Harsh Sentences. Daniel read the article quietly, his expression growing more serious with each paragraph. Says here that civil rights groups have been trying to build a case against him for 3 years. They got complaints, but never enough solid proof. Until now, David replied, patting the folder next to his coffee cup. Inside were transcripts, recordings, and detailed notes from their courtroom visits. But check this out. He pulled out a legal document he had requested from the court clerk. I asked for a list of all the cases Judge Whitman handled last month. Look at the sentences he gave out. Daniel studied the papers and his eyes widened. This can't be right. He gave a 22-year-old black guy 6 months in jail for shoplifting. A candy bar? Keep reading, David said grimly. A white college student caught with the same amount of stolen merchandise got community service and a warning? Daniel's voice rose slightly, causing a few other customers to glance over. He lowered his voice again. How is this legal? It's not, David replied. That's why we're here. Over the past month, the brothers had done more than just attend their own hearings. They had started watching Judge Whitman's other cases, sitting in the back of the courtroom and taking careful notes. What they found was a clear pattern of unfair treatment that went far beyond anything they had imagined. Young black men consistently received harsher sentences than white defendants for similar crimes. Hispanic families were spoken to more harshly and given less time to find proper legal representation. Well-dressed white defendants were often given multiple chances to explain their situations, while poor defendants of any color were rushed through the system. "Remember that case last Tuesday?" Daniel asked. "The white businessman who got caught driving drunk for the third time?" David nodded. Judge Whitman called it a momentary lapse in judgment and gave him probation. But the week before, he sentenced that young Hispanic father to a year in jail for the same exact charge. And both guys had the same lawyer, Daniel added. So, it wasn't about legal representation. The brothers had been documenting everything, but they were careful not to blow their cover. They continued to dress simply and speak with street accents whenever they were in the courthouse. Their own case had been postponed twice, which gave them more opportunities to observe Judge Whitman's behavior with other defendants. "We need to talk to some of these people," David said, looking at a list of names from recent cases. "Find out if they want to file complaints or join a larger case against him." "That's risky," Daniel replied. "If word gets back to the judge that people are organizing against him, he might change his behavior or figure out what we're doing." David stirred his coffee thoughtfully. "Maybe. But look at this case from yesterday." He showed Daniel another document. Roberto Martinez, age 19. First-time offense, caught with a small amount of marijuana. Judge Whitman gave him 8 months in county jail and a $5,000 fine. "That's insane for a first offense," Daniel said. "But here's the crazy part," David continued. 2 hours later, Judge Whitman handled the exact same charge against a college kid named Brandon Wells. Same amount of marijuana, same first offense. Brandon got a $100 fine and drug counseling. "Let me guess," Daniel said. "Roberto is Hispanic and Brandon is white?" "You got it." And Roberto's family was in the courtroom crying when the sentence was announced. His mom said he was the first person in their family to go to college, and now his life is ruined. The brothers sat in silence for a moment, thinking about the real impact of Judge Whitman's bias. These weren't just statistics or legal cases. These were real people whose lives were being destroyed by one man's prejudices. "We have to do something," Daniel said finally. "We are doing something," David replied, "but we have to be smart about it." That afternoon, they decided to take a risk. Instead of just observing, they would try to gather more evidence by talking to other defendants and their families. They started with Roberto Martinez's case, since it was the most recent and clearly unfair. They found Roberto's mother, Maria Martinez, waiting outside the courthouse after a hearing about her son's appeal. She was a small woman in her 50s, wearing a simple dress and clutching a worn purse. Her eyes were red from crying. "Excuse me, ma'am," David said gently, approaching her near the courthouse steps. "We're sorry to bother you, but we've been watching what happened to your son in Judge Whitman's court." Maria looked at them suspiciously at first, probably wondering if they were reporters or investigators. But when she saw their simple clothes and heard their street accents, her expression softened. "You know my Roberto?" she asked. "We seen his case," Daniel explained. "We got our own problems with that same judge. He don't seem to like people like us very much." Maria's eyes filled with tears again. "My son is a good boy," she said. "He made one mistake, one stupid mistake, and now his whole future is gone. He was studying to be a teacher. He wanted to help kids." "What did the judge say when your son tried to explain?" David asked. "He wouldn't let Roberto talk," Maria replied, her voice getting angry. "He kept interrupting, saying things about how people from your neighborhood always make excuses. He looked at my son like he was garbage." "Did your lawyer try to object?" Daniel asked. "The public defender was scared," Maria said. "You could see it in her face. She barely said anything. After the hearing, she told me that Judge Whitman has a reputation, but nobody wants to go against him because he's powerful." The brothers exchanged a look. This was exactly what they needed to hear, but it also made them angry. How many other families had been through this same situation? Mrs. Martinez, David said carefully, what if we told you that other people are having the same problems with this judge? Would you be interested in doing something about it? Maria's eyes lit up, with hope for the first time since they had started talking. You mean there's a way to fight back? Maybe, Daniel said. But it would mean you'd have to be brave and speak up about what happened. I'll do anything to help my son, Maria said firmly. And if it stops this judge from hurting other families, then it's the right thing to do. Over the next 2 weeks, the brothers carefully reached out to 5 other families who had been treated unfairly in Judge Whitman's court. Each story was heartbreaking and similar. Young men getting harsh sentences for minor crimes while watching white defendants get slaps on the wrist for worse offenses. Families being treated with disrespect and barely given time to understand what was happening. But something unexpected happened during their investigation. Word started spreading in the community about Judge Whitman's unfair treatment. People began comparing notes and realizing that their bad experiences weren't isolated incidents. A local civil rights organization heard about the growing complaints and started reaching out to the families. This is getting bigger than we planned, Daniel said as they sat in their usual spot at the coffee shop. Good, David replied. It should be bigger. This guy has been ruining lives for years. But what if he figures out what we're doing? Daniel asked. Our trial is next week. David smiled for the first time in days. Then next week is going to be very interesting. Neither brother knew that their final confrontation with Judge Whitman would be even more dramatic than they could have imagined. And neither of them realized that someone else in the courthouse had been watching their investigation unfold, someone who would play a crucial role in bringing justice to Judge Whitman's courtroom. The morning of their trial, David and Daniel woke up knowing this would be the most important day of their investigation. They had spent 3 months building their case against Judge Whitman, and today he would finally show his worst behavior in front of a packed courtroom. What they didn't expect was just how bad things would get. You ready for this? Daniel asked, as they put on their usual simple clothes and practiced their street accents one last time. As ready as we can be, David replied, checking his hidden recording equipment. Remember, let him do all the talking. The angrier he gets, the more evidence we collect. They arrived at the courthouse an hour early and noticed something different. Immediately, there were more people than usual waiting outside, including several individuals they recognized from their community outreach. Maria Martinez was there with her husband, along with 3 other families who had been treated unfairly by Judge Whitman. They had all come to watch the trial. This is either going to be perfect or a disaster, Daniel whispered as they walked past the growing crowd. Inside the courtroom, every seat was filled. Word had somehow spread about the Thompson brothers' case, and people were curious to see what would happen. The brothers spotted several reporters, a few local lawyers, and even a representative from the state civil rights organization. In the front row sat a well-dressed black woman they didn't recognize, taking careful notes. Judge Whitman entered the room and immediately noticed the crowd. His expression darkened as he saw the mix of people, especially the families from his previous cases. The brothers could tell he was already irritated and the trial hadn't even started yet. This is case number 47293, State versus David and Daniel Thompson, the clerk announced. As the brothers approached the front, Judge Whitman stared at them with pure annoyance. Well, gentlemen, we finally made it to your trial. I hope you've used these past months to think about the importance of taking responsibility for your actions. Yes, sir, Your Honor, David replied in his practiced, humble tone. We've been thinking about it real hard. Judge Whitman's jaw tightened at their grammar. I'm sure you have. Now, you've pleaded not guilty to running a red light, despite clear video evidence and witness testimony. Would you like to explain to this court why you think you're above the law? The question was loaded with assumptions and bias. Lisa Chen, their public defender, immediately stood up. Objection, Your Honor. The question assumes facts not in evidence and is argumentative. Judge Whitman turned his glare toward Lisa. Overruled. In my courtroom, I have the right to ask defendants to explain their thinking, especially when their behavior has wasted everyone's time for months. Lisa sat down, But the brothers could see she was taking notes furiously. So were several other people in the courtroom. The prosecutor, a tired-looking man named Kevin Walsh, presented the state's case quickly. The video evidence was clear. The brothers had indeed run a red light. But it was a minor violation that normally would have resulted in a simple fine. When it came time for the defense, Lisa stood up and began to present their case professionally. She explained that her clients were working 2 jobs each, had never been in trouble before, and were willing to accept responsibility with an appropriate penalty. "Your Honor," she said, "my clients are hard-working young men who made a simple mistake. They're not trying to avoid responsibility. They just want to be treated fairly like any other first-time offender." Judge Whitman's face showed disgust. "Treated fairly? Miss Chen, these 2 defendants have dragged this simple case through my court for months. They've wasted taxpayer money, court time, and shown complete disrespect for the legal system." "But, Your Honor," Lisa replied, "they have the right to a trial and—" "Don't lecture me about rights," Judge Whitman interrupted loudly. "I know more about rights than these 2 will ever understand. The problem is that some people think rights come without responsibilities." The way he said "some people" made everyone in the courtroom uncomfortable. The brothers could see people shifting in their seats and exchanging glances. "Your Honor," Daniel said, standing up slowly, "could you explain what you mean by some people?" The question caught Judge Whitman off guard. He stared at Daniel for a long moment, his face getting red. "Sit down," he snapped. "You'll speak when I tell you to speak." "But sir," David added, also standing, "we just trying to understand what we did wrong besides the traffic thing. You keep talking about how we disrespected the system, but we've been showing up every time you told us to." Judge Whitman's composure completely cracked. "You want to know what you did wrong? You came into my courtroom dressed like street thugs, speaking like you never finished elementary school, and acting like the rules don't apply to you." A murmur went through the courtroom. Several reporters were writing frantically. The well-dressed woman in the front row was recording everything on her phone. "Now, Your Honor," Lisa tried to interrupt, "that's completely inappropriate." "I'm not finished," Judge Whitman shouted, his voice echoing through the room. "This is exactly what's wrong with our society. Young men like these 2 think they can do whatever they want without consequences. They come from a culture that doesn't value education, hard work, or respect for authority." The courtroom erupted in whispers and gasps. Maria Martinez stood up in the back, her face filled with anger. 2 of the reporters were now openly filming with their phones. "Your Honor," David said, his voice still humble but with a slight edge, "what culture are you talking about?" Judge Whitman realized he had gone too far, but his anger wouldn't let him stop. "You know exactly what culture I'm talking about. The culture of entitlement, the culture of making excuses, the culture that produces young men who think society owes them something." "Are you talking about black culture, sir?" Daniel asked directly. The question hung in the air like a bomb about to explode. Everyone in the courtroom held their breath, waiting for the judge's response. "I'm talking about the culture of failure," Judge Whitman replied, his voice dripping with venom. "The culture that says it's okay to blame everyone else for your problems instead of taking personal responsibility." "But Your Honor," David said, "lots of successful people come from our neighborhood. Doctors, teachers, business owners. Are you saying they all come from a culture of failure?" Judge Whitman's face was now completely red. "Don't you dare try to turn this around on me. I've been fair to more people than you could ever imagine. But I won't sit here and let 2 troublemakers lecture me about fairness." "How are we troublemakers?" Daniel asked innocently. "We ain't never been arrested before. We both got jobs. We just ran a red light by accident. Because people like you always think you're the victims," Judge Whitman exploded. "You come into my courtroom with your attitudes and your excuses, expecting special treatment because of your background. Well, let me tell you something. In my courtroom, everyone gets treated exactly the same." The irony of his statement wasn't lost on anyone who had been watching his other cases. Lisa Chen actually laughed out loud before catching herself. "Something funny, Miss Chen?" Judge Whitman demanded. "No, Your Honor," she replied, but her tone made it clear she didn't believe a word he was saying. Judge Whitman turned back to the brothers. his anger now completely out of control. "I've had enough of this circus. You two want to play games? Fine. I'm going to give you exactly what you deserve." He banged his gavel so hard it sounded like a gunshot. "I find both defendants guilty of the traffic violation. I sentence you to the maximum fine of $2,000 each, plus 6 months community service, plus 30 days in county jail for contempt of court." The sentence was so outrageous that even the prosecutor looked shocked. For a simple traffic violation, most people got a $100 fine. "Furthermore," Judge Whitman continued, "I'm holding you both in contempt for your disrespectful attitude during this trial. Your bail is set at $10,000 each." The courtroom erupted in chaos. People were shouting, reporters were calling their editors, and Lisa Chen was frantically writing notes for an immediate appeal. But through all the noise, David and Daniel just looked at each other and smiled slightly. They had gotten everything they needed, and more. Judge Whitman had just destroyed his own career in front of dozens of witnesses, and every word was recorded for posterity. As the bailiff approached to take them into custody, David whispered to his brother, "Tomorrow is going to be very interesting." Neither of them could have imagined just how interesting tomorrow would actually be. Judge Whitman arrived at his courthouse the next morning, expecting another normal day of cases. He was still feeling satisfied about how he had handled the Thompson brothers, thinking he had finally put those troublemakers in their place. What he found instead would be the last normal moment of his career. The parking lot was filled with news vans. Reporters with cameras and microphones crowded around the courthouse entrance. Police cars and official government vehicles lined the street. Judge Whitman's stomach dropped as he realized something very big was happening, and he had a terrible feeling it involved him. Inside the courthouse, his usual courtroom was packed with people he didn't recognize. Men and women in expensive suits sat in the front rows. FBI agents stood near the doors. The well-dressed black woman who had been taking notes during yesterday's trial was now sitting at the prosecutor's table, looking very official. "What is going on here?" Judge Whitman demanded as he entered his chambers. His court clerk Janet looked pale and nervous. "Sir, there are federal agents here to see you, and the state attorney general's office. They say they need to speak with you immediately." Before Judge Whitman could respond, 3 people in suits entered his chambers. The lead investigator, a tall man with gray hair, showed his badge. "Judge Whitman, I'm Agent Richardson from the FBI. We need you to come with us." "This is ridiculous," Judge Whitman protested. "I'm a sitting judge. You can't just barge into my chambers and—" "Actually, sir, we can," Agent Richardson interrupted. "You're being investigated for civil rights violations, abuse of power, and judicial misconduct. We have a warrant." Judge Whitman's face went white. "This is some kind of mistake. What evidence could you possibly have?" Agent Richardson smiled grimly. "More than you can imagine. Please come with us." As they walked back into the courtroom, Judge Whitman saw something that made his blood run cold. David and Daniel Thompson were standing at the prosecutor's table, but they looked completely different. Gone were the simple clothes and street accents. Instead, they wore perfectly tailored suits and spoke with the clear, educated voices of trained attorneys. "Good morning, Judge Whitman," David said, his voice now carrying the authority of someone who had graduated at the top of his law school class. "I believe we need to have a conversation." Judge Whitman stared at them in shock. Who are you?" "My name is David Thompson, and this is my brother Daniel," David replied formally. "We're special investigators for the State Attorney General's office, and we've been conducting an undercover investigation into discriminatory practices in your courtroom." The judge's legs nearly gave out. He grabbed the back of a chair to steady himself. "This is impossible. You're just 2 kids from the street." Daniel stepped forward, his transformation even more dramatic than his brother's. "Actually, we both graduated summa cum laude from Harvard Law School. I specialize in civil rights law, and David focuses on judicial misconduct cases. We've been investigating you for the past 4 months." The well-dressed woman from the front row stood up and approached the group. "Judge Whitman, I'm Assistant Attorney General Patricia Williams. These 2 investigators have been working under My direct supervision to document patterns of bias and discrimination in your courtroom. Judge Whitman looked around the packed courtroom, finally understanding the magnitude of what was happening. Every person he had treated unfairly was there. Maria Martinez sat in the front row with tears in her eyes, but this time, they were tears of joy. Roberto's case file was open on the table along with dozens of others. "This is entrapment," Judge Whitman said desperately. "You tricked me." "No, sir," David replied calmly. "We gave you every opportunity to treat us fairly, every opportunity to show basic human decency. Instead, you chose to reveal your true character." Daniel walked over to a large television screen that had been set up in the courtroom. "We'd like to show everyone exactly what kind of character that is." The screen came to life, showing video footage from their very first hearing. Judge Whitman's voice filled the room. "This is exactly what's wrong with the system. People come into my courtroom with no understanding of the law, no respect for the process, and expect everything to be handed to them." The footage continued, showing clip after clip of the judge's inappropriate comments, biased behavior, and discriminatory treatment. The courtroom watched in stunned silence as month after month of evidence played out on screen. "People like that come in here expecting everything to be explained to them like they're children," the judge's recorded voice said. "No personal responsibility whatsoever." Judge Whitman slumped into a chair, watching his career destroyed one recorded comment at a time. But the brothers weren't finished. "We also documented your sentencing patterns," David announced, pulling out a thick folder. "Over the past year, you sentenced black defendants to an average of 63% longer jail time than white defendants for identical crimes. Hispanic defendants received 58% longer sentences," Daniel added. "Young men from low-income neighborhoods were 47% more likely to have their cases delayed, forcing them to miss work and school." Assistant Attorney General Williams stepped forward. "Judge Whitman, based on this evidence, you are hereby removed from the bench pending a full federal investigation. You are also under arrest for violating the civil rights of numerous defendants." The courtroom erupted in applause. Maria Martinez was crying and hugging the person next to her. Several other families who had been victims of the judge's bias were cheering and clapping. But Judge Whitman wasn't done fighting. "This is a setup," he shouted. "These two came into my courtroom acting like criminals. They were disrespectful. And, sir," David interrupted, his voice cutting through the noise, "we acted exactly like hundreds of other defendants who have appeared in your courtroom. The only difference is that we were recording your response. We spoke respectfully," Daniel added. "We followed all courtroom procedures. We never raised our voices or showed any disrespect. The only thing we did was exist as young black men in your courtroom." Agent Richardson stepped forward with handcuffs. "Judge Harold Whitman, you are under arrest for conspiracy to violate civil rights, abuse of power under color of law, and obstruction of justice." As the handcuffs clicked into place, Judge Whitman looked at the brothers one last time. "You destroyed my career. I've been a judge for 15 years. David's response was quiet but firm. "You destroyed your own career the moment you decided that some people deserved justice and others didn't. We just made sure everyone could see it." The brothers watched as Judge Whitman was led out of his own courtroom in handcuffs. The man who had spent months looking down on them, making assumptions about their intelligence and character, was now facing federal charges that could send him to prison for years. Assistant Attorney General Williams addressed the packed courtroom. "Over the next few months, we'll be reviewing every case that Judge Whitman handled in the past 5 years. Any defendant who believes they were treated unfairly will have the opportunity to appeal their conviction or sentence." She paused and looked directly at the families in the audience. "Justice delayed is justice denied, but justice will come. We promise you that." After the courtroom cleared, David and Daniel stood alone for a moment, still processing what they had accomplished. "Think he learned anything?" Daniel asked. David shook his head. "People like him never learn. But maybe the next judge will think twice before treating people unfairly. And maybe some of those families will get their lives back," Daniel replied, as they walked out of the courthouse for the last time. The brothers were approached by reporters wanting interviews, but they politely declined, saying their work spoke for itself. 6 months later, Judge Whitman was sentenced to 3 years in federal prison. Roberto Martinez had his conviction overturned and returned to college to become the teacher he had always wanted to be. 12 other defendants had their cases dismissed or sentences reduced. The Thompson brothers returned to their regular jobs at the Attorney General's office, but their undercover work had changed how the entire state handled judicial misconduct. New oversight programs were put in place, and judges received mandatory training on bias and discrimination. Most importantly, courtrooms across the state became a little more fair, a little more just, and a little more welcoming to people from all backgrounds. Because sometimes justice comes disguised as two young men in simple clothes, speaking truth to power, and making sure that everyone gets treated with the dignity they deserve. The brothers had proven that justice isn't about what you look like or how you talk. It's about courage, determination, and the belief that everyone deserves to be treated fairly under the law.